up, YouTube? This is the 82-0 podcast. Today we're going to talk about Jerry West. Now, Jerry West was born May 28th, 1938. He was born in Cheylin, West Virginia. And West was born into a poor household in Cheylin, West Virginia. He was the fifth of six children. His mother was a housewife, and his father, Howard, was a coal mine electrician. West's father physically abused West all throughout his childhood, and there were times where Jerry West would go to bed with a loaded gun underneath his bed out of fear that he might have to kill his dad for self-defense. And his father was very abusive to his mother. West was outgoing and aggressive child in his early days. However, in 1951, after the death of his brother David, who was killed in action during the Korean War, the trauma turned West into a shy, introverted boy. And he became so small and frail that he needed vitamin injections from his doctor. And he was kept apart from childhood sports to prevent him from getting seriously injured. Growing up, West spent his days hunting and fishing, but his main activity was shooting at a basketball court. Now, West attended East Bank High School in East Bank, West Virginia, from 1952 to 1956. During his first year, he was benched by his coach, Duke Shaver, due to the lack of his height. Shaver emphasized the importance of conditioning and defense, which were lessons that teenagers appreciated. Now, West, when he was going into high school in the summer of 1953, he grew to 6 feet tall. West would eventually become the team's starting small forward and quickly established himself as the best high school player in West Virginia. He was named to All-State from 1953 to 1956. He had All-American honors in 1956. And West was the Virginia Player of the Year, becoming the state's first high school player to score more than 900 points in a single season, with an average of 32.2 points per game. And this is when West would start working on his jump shot. He had an act for scoring well under pressure, and this carried over to the NBA. West led East Bank to a state championship on March 24th. That year prompted East Bank High School to change its name to West Bank High School. Every year on March 24th, in honor of a basketball prodigy, they practiced that effect until the high school closed in 1999. It was a very small school, so it wasn't able to stay open. Now, West would go on to graduate from high school in 1956, and he had more than 60 universities showing interest in him. And he eventually chose to stay close to home because he wanted to be near his mother to protect her, just in case something went down with his dad. So he went to West Virginia University. And in his freshman year, in the 56-57 season, West was a member of the WVU freshman squad that achieved a perfect record of 17 wins without a loss over the course of the season. Other team members include Jay Jacobs and Willie Akers. Now, West scored 17.8 points per game, and he averaged 11.1 rebounds per game. He also started in all 28 games while shooting 49% from the field and 73% from the free throw line. The performances earned him a multitude of honors, among of which was the All-American Third Team and the First Team All-Southern Conference. And one thing I want to talk about is his efficiency. As I mentioned, he scored 49% field goal shooting. I think the 60s is when you started to see flashes of the modern game. Obviously, it's a lot different than today, but I want to say it's more recognizable to today's game. The field goal shooting went up, the size of the players went up, and in my opinion, Jerry West is one of those players that could play in any era. He was just so skilled on both ends of the court in his shooting. So during his junior year of 58-59, West scored 26.6 points per game and grabbed 12.3 rebounds per game. He tied NCAA 5-game tournament record of 160 points, 32 points per game, and he led all scorers in rebounds in every West Virginia game. And there was a game where he had 28 points and 11 rebounds in a 71-70 loss to California in the finals. West was named Most Outstanding Player of that year's Final Four. Further awards were All-American Southern Conference Tournament MVP and Southern Conference Player of the Year. Now, in his final collegiate season, 59-60, West enjoyed several career highs. His scoring would go up to 29.3 points per game. He averaged 16.5 rebounds per game, and he shot 50% from the field. And again, he was selected to the All-American Conference, and he was voted the Southern Conference MVP. West's best performance was a game against Virginia, which he grabbed 16 rebounds and scored 40 points. So, after his collegiate career, one thing I want to bring up is he would go to the 1960 Summer Olympics. And he was on the same team as Oscar Robertson, which is something I think is pretty cool. And they had an undefeated record. They went 8-0, which I think is pretty cool. And I put that up there with the other great international team, the other great U.S. Olympic teams, because I consider 92 to be the best one, and 2008 to be the second best one, and 1960 to be the third best one. I mean, you had a whole bunch of good guys. You had Walt Bellamy on that team, Jerry Lucas, Oscar Robertson, Jerry West. It was just an incredible team. Like I said, they go 8-0, they won a gold medal, and they blew teams out. Like, for example, they beat Japan 125-66. It wasn't even fair. So, anyways, he declares for the draft after this, and he made himself available. So, in the 1960 draft, he was drafted by the second overall pick by the Minneapolis Lakers. Now, shortly before the team would relocate to Los Angeles. So he didn't actually play a game in Minneapolis, because that offseason that they drafted him is when they relocated. And in his first season, I mean, he had a good year, but it wasn't as good. He wasn't as good as he'd become. He put up 17 points per game, 7 rebounds, and 4 assists. Now, if there was a Most Improved Player of the Year award back then, he would have got it in the 61-62 season, because he put up 30 points per game, 7.9 rebounds, 5.4 assists. And all throughout the 60s, you see he had pretty solid numbers. His best scoring mark came in the 65-66 season, where he scored 31.3 points per game. However, they were never able to get it done. In 1962, they lost to the Boston Celtics in Game 7. And this was, the Lakers only lost by 3 points. And this would start the trend of Jerry West losing. And this would have impacts on him off of the court, because the thing you got to know about Jerry West is he was a super competitive guy, and he took every loss very hard. He battled with depression for most of his career because of him losing. So he would lose 62 in the finals, he would lose 63 in the finals to Boston. He would lose 65 to Boston. He would lose 66 to Boston in 7 games. He would lose to Boston again in 68 in 6 games. And I think the lowest part of his career would be in the off season for the 68-69 season, the Los Angeles Lakers got Wilt Chamberlain. And Wilt was still in his prime, so this was the first super team, I'd say, in NBA history. And by super team, I mean team to build a group of at least 3 All-Stars through trade or signing. And so Jerry West, Elgin Baylor, who was his teammate throughout the 60s, and Wilt Chamberlain were supposed to win it all. That year they went 55-27. The Boston Celtics made it to the finals, but they were only 48-34. And the Lakers were younger, quicker, but they couldn't get it done. Because in the Game 7, this is how confident the Lakers were that they'd win. The owner put up all these balloons celebrating that the Lakers would win it. Just prior to Game 7. They were so confident that they were going to win that they didn't even consider the possibility of losing. And this pissed the Boston Celtics off. And they would win it 108-106. And this has got to be the worst part of Jerry West's career. I've heard him say it drove him to depression. And I know he did battle with drinking. I'm not saying he was like an alcoholic, but this was definitely the low part of his career, and he played out of his absolute freaking mind in that finals. Jerry West would, for that series, right? He was the only player in NBA history to be named Finals MVP on a losing team. He put up an insane 37.9 points per game, 4.7 rebounds, and 7.4 assists. But it's not his fault that he lost. I mean, Wilt Chamberlain choked. He only put up 11 points per game in that whole series. You know? If Chamberlain would have just put up 5 points per game more, they probably would have won the series. You know? All he needed was a couple baskets in that Game 7. But that's a topic for another day. And in that Game 7, West had 42 points. You can't really blame Jerry West. Now, going into the 69-70 season, the team would battle with injuries. Wilt only played 12 games. But they'd make it back to the finals. And again, they lose in 7 games, this time to the New York Knicks. Which, theoretically, they were supposed to win this game, too, because Willis Reed, the best player on the Knicks, was hurt. And he only played a couple minutes of that Game 7. He came out there to rally his team around him. He played 27 minutes, but he only had 4 points. But his appearance alone riled up the Knicks, and Walt Frazier would score 36 points and 19 assists on the Knicks. So again, Jerry West loses. And in 1971, they lose to the up-and-coming Milwaukee Bucks in the conference finals. You know, the Milwaukee Bucks had a 24-year-old Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, was the best player in the league. And so it was starting to look like, at the beginning of the 71-72 season, 9 games into the season, Elgin Baylor decides to retire. And at this point, the Lakers' record is 6-3. So, you know, it's a fairly average start. So it's starting to look like this team's window of opportunity is closed. But Jerry West and the Lakers go on a 33-game winning streak. And right after Elgin Baylor retires. And they would finish the season off with 69 wins, which was a record for the time. And they would finally win the finals. They beat the Milwaukee Bucks in the conference finals, and then they'd beat the Knicks in the finals, correcting their 2 wrongs from the 2 previous years. So it was amazing, and this was the highlight of Jerry West's life. You know, he finally got his first ring. And it's unfortunate because the following year, they had a great season, and they go back to the finals, but they lose to the New York Knicks. So, in all, he's 1-8 in the finals. And by this time, the team was too old to get back. So, Wilt Chamberlain retired, and Jerry West would go on and play one more season after that in 73, 74. But he was dealing with injuries, and he only played 31 games. He only averaged 20 points, and he retired. So that was the end of his career. But I want to talk about him as the executive. He's, in my opinion, the greatest executive of all time, because he won the Executive of the Year twice, right? And he was the Lakers executive from 82 to the year 2000. And he was the Grizzlies executive from 2002 to 2007. He helped build the Shaq and Kobe Lakers. So he's a very smart executive. He made some really smart moves. He made some very smart picks. And he also was the reason he helped convince Paul George and Kawhi Leonard to go to the Clippers. So he's pretty, and I also want to mention too, he was the executive of the Golden State Warriors from 2011 to 2017. And he was the reason why they brought over Kevin Durant. So, like I said, then he would go to the Clippers in 2017. He's still on the executive board there. And I should mention he was on the executive board, not the executive per se. He's the general manager of the Grizzlies, general manager of the Lakers, but he was on the executive board of the Warriors, the Clippers, and on December 17, 2020, it was reported that West and the LA Clippers underwent an investigation by the NBA because I guess he had been texting Kawhi Leonard over the offseason or something. Or not during the offseason, during the season to help recruit him. So I don't know if you want to consider that a stain on his legacy, but he's one of the greatest executives of all time, too. I mean, think about this. 3 championships. Well, really, if you want to count the 80s championships, he's got 8 championships under his belt with the Lakers as an executive. He turned the Grizzlies into somewhat contenders in the early 2000s. They got 3 championships, or I should say 2 championships under the Golden State Warriors. So that's 10 championships. And the Clippers are no longer a joke because of him. And he was a coach briefly for the Lakers in the late 70s, but he couldn't really get it done. And let's describe how he played. He was kind of like a combo guard. He could play the point guard, he could play the shooting guard, great on defense. And I want to talk about how clutch he was. One of his nicknames was Mr. Clutch, because I encourage everybody to look into this. In Game 3 of the 1970 NBA Finals against the New York Knicks, he hit a 60-foot buzzer beater, right, to send it into overtime. So think about if they had the 3-point line back then. That would have been a game winner, which means they probably would have won that series. So the Lakers, they might have won the series that year. So I don't like to put an asterisk on championships, but you can't blame him you can't blame all of his defeats on him. He came through every time. And very clutch. So let's talk about his accolades. He's a 14-time All-Star, 1972 assist champion, 12-time All-NBA, 5-time All-Defense. Although he would have had more, they didn't start keeping track of All-Defense until the 69 season. And he's the 69 Finals MVP. He's on the NBA 75th anniversary team and the 50th anniversary team. And in my opinion, he's the best guard of the 1960s and early 70s. And in my opinion, I'll put this out there. I think he's in the conversation. It's really hard to rank him, right? Because when you go to make top shooting guard lists, people will bring up, well, he was a point guard. Okay, and then you go to make a top point guards list, and then they say, oh, well, he was a shooting guard. It's kind of hard to rank him, you know? But let's just talk about him as a shooting guard, right? Because I think he was more of a shooting guard than a point guard. I know he played the point guard, especially more towards the later part of his career. That's when he started averaging more assists. But he played like a shooting guard. And I want to say, I think, in my opinion, Jordan's the best shooting guard of all time. Kobe's the second best shooting guard of all time. And I would put Jerry West at number 3. That's where I have him. I don't care if anybody disagrees with that. You're entitled to your opinion. But that's where I rank him. He's got career averages of 27 points per game, 5.8 rebounds, and 6.7 assists, and 2.6 steals. So that's Jerry West. Thanks for watching.